Good morning, Dan and Amy. Well, Charles de Gaulle asked the question, how can anyone govern a nation that has 246 different cheeses? And it's a good question. And I don't
I
know
think
if
you tweeted that over the weekend, didn't you?
I did. Well,
Oh, no, I'm
it's
stalking
it's a
you.
de Gaulleism. Oh, yeah, I love a good de Gaulleism, especially in the context of a French election. One socialist beating the other, Macron, the
Beating Le
victor.
Pen. And do you know what Le Pen did after her loss? She went to the bar and was dancing YMCA and I Love Rock and Roll by Joan Jett.
She also
Seriously, that's what she did.
She also precluded the media from attending her concession speech to her supporters, which was interesting. And it's also interesting, I mean, just to point this out, with the gender identity politics that the left in this country obsesses about, that Le Pen is a woman,
She is?
Macron is a man, so I guess support for men versus women isn't about the sisterhood if you don't hew to the left orthodoxy. I guess that's the case, as should be obvious by now. But it isn't all. For more on this topic and many other geopolitical matters, we're pleased to be joined by Bill Gertz, senior editor for the Washington Free Beacon. His new book, I War and Peace in the Information Age. Bill, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hi, good morning, Dan and Amy. Good to be on the show.
And so with Macron's election in France and a lot of concerns, including per some documents that were leaked over the weekend that the press didn't report on, about his posture towards Islamists. And this turns out to be, of course, a big national security problem in France and thus Western Europe, the fifth column action happening in France at the hands of Islamic extremists, and the question about Macron's disposition towards that. What's your read on that?
Well, he's a centrist, comes from a financial background, and has kind of said he's going to take a tougher position on that. There's a lot of places in France that are kind of no-go areas where Islamists have established Sharia law, and this is a real problem. I think he's going to try and dial that back, and it remains to be seen whether he'll be able to do that. But that at least looks like his intentions now that he's been elected.
Well, they're saying that he survived 2 elections and a hack attack. Of course, they pinned it on the Russians. Is there any truth to that? And what are your sources telling you about what those actual hackings were?
Well, it looked as though, it was like similar to what happened to the Podesta emails. It's probably a Russian intelligence operation to try and get into his emails and provide damaging information that could perhaps influence the election. This is par for the course. The FBI director testified that the Russian hacking has not stopped, and the what they call the cyber-enabled influence operation to try and skew elections, not just in the United States, but especially in Europe, and even more importantly for the Russians in Eastern Europe. They're still very active on the hacking and influence operation front.
You wrote last week about the effort to counter Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime as it pertains to nuclear sites and doing nuclear testing. Where does that stand with respect to Trump's policy on the matter and its effectiveness?
Yeah, I had a column in the Asia Times with the headline, The Dog That Didn't Bark, based on the Sherlock Holmes story about a horse that was stolen by its trainer, and Sherlock Holmes figured it out because the trainer's dog didn't bark at the time of the theft. It's similar in the case of North Korea planning a nuclear test. And U.S. intelligence believes that the Chinese somehow, at least so far, have prevailed on Pyongyang not to conduct a 6th underground nuclear test. Again, this is something that the U.S. has said would be a major provocation, and of course we've got some warships surrounding the Korean Peninsula now, so things are still pretty tense over there.
And what about with respect to our South Korean allies, the provision of advanced equipment that they could employ as needed as well?
Well, definitely the situation in South Korea is they're getting ready for a next election, and it looks like the next South Korean president is going to be pro-North Korean. and that's going to be very interesting.
Well, how does that work?
Well, he's a liberal, and the liberals in South Korea have adopted, going back to the number of administrations a few years ago, something called the Sunshine Policy, which has been basically, if you're nice to North Korea, then they'll be nice in return. It was a big failure then. It would be a big failure again if they tried a new guy.
You mean the dictatorships don't respond well to weakness? Imagine that.
Exactly. The latest news is that they've detained another American at this privately funded university in Pyongyang. That means four Americans are now in the Huskow in North Korea. The latest was a professor who was getting ready to leave the country on Saturday, and so now you have, and of course, Kim Jong-un, the dictator there, is alleging some massive CIA South Korean plot to assassinate him.
Now, there was some talk of President Trump actually speaking directly with Kim Jong-un. Do you think that would be effective?
This is the result of, he's made a statement to the effect that, he'd be willing to meet with Kim Jong-un, and this is part of the new Trump administration policy. They want to open the way for talks with North Korea if North Korea changes its behavior, like stopping its nuclear tests and halting long-range missile development. There's no indication that they're going to halt their long-range missile development. That's an active program, although they haven't done a test of a long-range missile. But this is kind of the carrot and stick approach of the new administration, trying to coax them in. And of course, the Chinese have been pushing for the renewal of so-called six-party talks, which failed miserably to try and halt North Korea's nuclear program probably 10 years ago, and they're still kind of pushing that approach as well.
Spinning the globe and landing on South America, there was a heartbreaking piece in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend. Venezuela is starving that detailed just how bad things have gotten there. Of course, there were protests in the last week where some 36 have been killed. The opposition leader, Maduro's opposition leader, has been jailed, and Marco Rubio confirmed that he had been taken to a military hospital in Caracas in serious condition. So kind of last gaps of Maduro, potentially before he's deposed or the country further breaks apart. And I just wonder what your sense is in terms of how destabilizing is the meltdown in Venezuela with respect to South America and our relationship in the region.
Well, it's an oil-rich country. It is on the verge of collapse, and the reports I've heard are that there are Cuban security personnel there trying to shore up the leftist regime there. Again, Cuba had an active role in keeping that country on the so-called socialist path for so long. It remains to be seen what's going to happen down there, but definitely economically, that country is a mess.
He is Bill Gertz, senior editor for the Washington Free Beacon and author of the book I War and Peace in the Information Age. Bill, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you very much.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.